All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into something pretty fascinating, the idea of the Fourfold Gospel.
Okay.
Now, when you hear that, you probably think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right.
Those four Gospels, those four books in the New Testament. And yeah, those are definitely a big part of it. But what we're going to be looking at today is how a few sources interpret this whole thing as kind of a deeper mystery, like a potential revelation about what is the nature of Christ and how it unfolds, like within each of us as individuals.
Yeah, it's really interesting from the perspective of these sources, how often we come to biblical prophecy and we're looking for, a literal historical figure,
Right.
or a specific event in the future. And these sources are saying that the ancient prophets, they were searching themselves. They were trying to understand, like, when is the Spirit of Christ going to happen in me?
Right.
So they weren't looking outward.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
like an internal thing.
Yeah.
And I think what's really cool is that these sources propose that the four Gospels give us four distinct ways of understanding God, like embodied as Christ. So, think about it like this. So you have Matthew, and Matthew presents Jesus as the king, like the promised ruler, right? And then you have Mark, who presents him as the ultimate servant,
Right.
Defined by his dedication.
Yeah.
And then you have Luke. And Luke is depicting him as this ideal man,
Yeah.
like the peak human.
Right.
And then, of course, you have John. And John just straight up reveals him as God himself. And so the sources argue that this, like, four-faceted view can help us to understand why Jesus seems to be presented in, like, kind of different ways in the New Testament. Let's unpack this idea a little bit. Where does this even come from?
Yeah.
Where do the sources take us?
Well, they take us back to the Old Testament, and specifically to this image of the stump of Jesse in Isaiah.
Right.
And Jesse, there are some interpretations that connect that to the meaning I am,
Okay.
which is linked to the name Jehovah, the name of God. And so this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This idea of God falling or sacrificing himself.
Okay.
And so if we kind of consider it from the broader picture of what the sources are saying, this falling is this is a pivotal thing.
Okay.
The idea is that the true of life, which is representing God, willingly descended.
Right.
And this self-sacrifice is the very means by which we have redemption and life can come in us. And it's this mystery,
Yeah.
of life coming through what seems like the death of God's initial form.
Right. And so it's interesting because the imagery does evolve, right? We have the stump of Jesse giving rise to the branch,
Right.
which is, the branch is representing that new life. But then in Daniel, we see this image of a tree being cut down. Its branches and leaves are removed, but the stump remains.
Yeah.
And then following that, the imagery focuses in on a man who, for a time, loses his human intellect and is given the mind of a beast.
Right.
And so this kind of progression, right, from a stump that kind of remains to this man who undergoes this strange transformation, I think is really significant.
Right.
And so how do these Old Testament prophecies, the way that the sources understand them, connect to the four Gospels?
Yeah.
What's the deal there?
Yeah, well, they're proposing that each of the Gospels specifically highlights a different facet of this promised branch, which
Okay.
originates from that stump of I am.
Okay, cool. So let's begin then with Matthew. Matthew presents Jesus squarely as the king, right? The one who fulfills the prophecy from Jeremiah. I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king. So the emphasis there is clearly on his, like, royal authority.
Right, exactly. And so Matthew's genealogy plays a crucial role here.
Right.
Because it meticulously traces Jesus' ancestry back to David,
Right.
the divinely chosen king of Israel. And it's helpful to know that royal genealogies, they typically begin with the founder of the dynasty.
Right.
And then they follow the line of succession down to the current ruler.
Right.
And Matthew, he adheres to this structure,
Okay.
thereby, underscoring Jesus' legitimate claim to David's throne.
Okay, great. So let's move on now to Mark. So Mark's giving us a very different picture.
Yeah.
Christ is the servant, the quintessential servant. And notably, in this gospel, there is no genealogy.
Right.
So why is that, according to the sources?
Well, the core identity of a servant, as these sources are, interpreting it, is their is their dedication and service to their master.
Mm-hmm.
So in this context, Jesus' identity is established through his unwavering commitment and service to the Lord. As prophesied in Zechariah, behold, I will bring forth my servant the branch.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark's gospel, it really embodies this because it focuses on Jesus's actions and ministry.
Right.
When your whole being is defined by service,
Yeah.
then earthly lineage
Right.
becomes kind of irrelevant.
Right. Right. And Mark does record that Jesus himself said, "I came not to be served, but to serve."
Right.
So that's a really stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
Between like royal descent and like pure service.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Luke.
Hmm.
So Luke presents Jesus as this perfect, this ideal man, what the source is called Jehovah's man.
Yeah.
And here we encounter that prophecy from Zechariah again. Behold the man whose name is the branch.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, that Isaiah 40, it also speaks of the man, but it doesn't specifically use that title, branch.
Right.
So Luke's focus on Jesus as this ideal man, it brings the significance of the genealogy back.
But what's really interesting is that Luke's genealogy, it differs from Matthew's.
Right.
So while both of them trace Jesus back to David, their paths like diverge after that.
Yes. And this is very significant.
Right.
Because, in Luke's lineage, it goes through David's son, Nathan,
Right.
rather than Solomon. And it ultimately extends all the way back to Adam,
Right.
who is referred to as the son of God.
Right. And this difference in genealogies is really, really significant.
It is.
Like, it's not just two different, historical accounts
Right.
of the same, family tree. Literally.
Right.
These different lineages, they're meant to point to something, a deeper meaning.
Exactly. The sources are emphasizing here that we shouldn't get so caught up
Yeah.
in this idea of a single literal historical person.
Right.
But instead, these varying genealogies are pointing towards a more profound mystery that transcends a purely physical lineage.
Yeah.
Right.
They're highlighting different essential aspects
Right.
of this unfolding Christ.
Okay. And so that leads us to John. So John takes an even more direct route, right? He presents Jesus as God himself. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, a genealogy is not even considered necessary here.
Right. When the subject is God incarnate,
Yeah.
the question of earthly lineage, it's immaterial.
Right.
And so John's gospel, it resonates with the prophecy in Isaiah. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious. And furthermore, Jesus, he consistently refers to himself as I am throughout John's gospel. And this powerfully underscores his divine nature.
Yeah.
He's not just like God. He is God according to this gospel.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we've looked at these four presentations: king, servant, ideal man, and God.
Right.
But here's the really, really important thing
Yeah.
that these sources are emphasizing. Christ is not just a historical figure
Right.
from 2,000 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but instead, Christ is understood as a series of mystical experiences
Yeah.
that occur within each individual for their own personal salvation.
Yeah, and this is where, the interpretation gets really compelling because the Gospels then, in this view, they're not just historical records, but they're narratives describing these internal spiritual events.
Right.
They're stories of how God reveals himself within the individual's inner being.
Right.
And they even quote Luke 24.35. And the Moffat translation highlights this because it says, they related their own experiences.
Right.
And so this completely changes the way we understand these texts.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. It shifts the focus from external events to an internal process.
Yeah.
And this leads us to Luke's opening verses.
Okay.
And the sources draw attention to this Greek word, anothen, which is typically translated as from above. Right. We all know it from John 3.3,
Yeah.
born from above.
Yeah.
But in Luke, it's translated as for some time past.
Right.
So what's the deal with this difference in translation?
Well, the sources are suggesting that Luke, or whoever wrote the gospel, they observed these spiritual events, with a level of insight, and so they're viewing them from above, so to speak.
Okay.
And their intention was to present these experiences in a way that was orderly and understandable
Right.
for those who were receptive to God's message, the Theophilus that he acknowledged in the beginning.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily a strictly chronological account of a single person's life, but rather a structured presentation of these inner revelations as they unfold.
Right. And so this ties into the power of God's name, I am. And the sources explain that we're not meant to call upon I am as this separate external entity, but rather to recognize and claim it as our own inherent identity.
Right.
When we are assuming a desired state of being.
Right.
So instead of, praying in the name of I am, grant me health, we would say, I am healthy.
Right.
Recognizing that divine potential within ourselves.
Exactly. It's about embodying that I amness, acknowledging that divine presence within, and using that intrinsic power to shape our reality through conscious assumption.
Right.
It's about claiming the identity, not appealing to some external force.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And so this leads us to something that's shared within the source material, which is a vision.
Okay.
And this is a vision of an endless field of human faces, all rooted like flowers moving together in this perfect synchronization. So it kind of evokes this sense of, deep interconnectedness.
Yeah.
But also perhaps a lack of individual autonomy. And so what's really striking about this vision is that it's contrasted with the individual's lived experience of freedom and the power of choice. Even within our limitations.
Right. Yeah.
And so the takeaway from the vision was that despite the limitations, there's still this profound sense of individual being and independent will that seemed to transcend this unified collective movement that was depicted in the vision.
Yeah.
And so the source connects this vision back to the stump of Jesse and this whole concept of God falling and taking up residence within the individual.
Right.
So it's almost as if, we were once a part of this unified field.
Yeah.
But for the purpose of individual growth and spiritual evolution, there was a descent. There was a taking on of this individual human form.
Right.
And this also relates to that prophecy about, the mind of man being replaced by the mind of a beast.
Right.
Which is this temporary state before this spiritual awakening.
Right.
And the source brings in this reference to Mark 8.24.
Okay.
Where the blind man sees men like trees walking.
Right.
And the source connects this to the idea of an inverted tree.
Yeah.
Right. Which perhaps represents the nervous system.
Yeah.
And this eventual turning up. Right. This shift in perception.
Right.
Which leads to a clearer spiritual sight.
Right.
Right. So let's look at Isaiah 9.6. So it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." And the sources emphasize that in ancient Hebrew, there's no punctuation.
Right.
So there's a potential significance to these four titles when they're viewed all together.
Yeah, and the interpretation here is that these four titles, they correspond directly to the fourfold gospel perspectives we've been looking at. Right. So Wonderful Counselor is linked to the idea of omniscience, all-knowing wisdom.
Right.
Mighty God signifies divine omnipotence, unlimited power.
Right.
Everlasting Father is connected to eternal fatherhood and the concept of the Son being given.
Right.
And Prince of Peace points towards the ultimate state of peace. That's achieved at the culmination of the earthly journey.
Right. And so it all comes back to this main idea, which is that the Gospels aren't just, biographies of this historical figure.
Right. Yeah.
But rather it's an unfolding revelation.
Yeah.
Of Christ the branch within each individual.
Yeah, it's a personal journey of discovery.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so it's a process that begins with hearing and embracing the word, the logos, or the dabar, which carries with it this inherent power of its own manifestation. And this word then takes root in the stump of I am.
Leading to the emergence of the branch, which is the Christ consciousness. And then the descent of the Spirit. And as Isaiah 55.101 reminds us, God's word will not return void, but it will accomplish its purpose.
That's right.
And the sources are making this really clear that this unfolding isn't something that we earn through our actions or like our merit or anything like that. It's something we accept through belief.
Yeah.
And recognition of that inherent divine potential that's within us.
Right.
The source also talks about, the concept of union with Christ in death and resurrection, referencing Romans 6. And so the insight here is that the death, that metaphorical falling of the tree, is seen as having already occurred on this like spiritual level. And we are already united with Christ in that death. And so therefore the resurrection isn't this single like future event, but rather it's an ongoing series
of these mystical experiences.
Right.
It's a progressive unfolding of Christ within our own being.
Yeah.
The source also addresses the prophecy of the mind of a beast from Daniel.
Okay.
And they draw some connections to, historical instances of just cruelty and inhumanity.
Yeah.
And so it's presented as like this stark reminder of a particular state of consciousness that precedes the full acceptance of the Christian story.
Right, right. And so these periods of, characterized by darkness and seemingly just base instincts, they're interpreted as necessary stages before a spiritual reversal can occur.
Right.
The stump can't produce a new shoot until it has received the word of God.
Right.
And so this underscores the importance of sharing this message, spreading this understanding.
Yeah.
And there's this biblical story, of the 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace and the appearance of the fourth figure, which is symbolizing divine presence and protection.
Right.
And so it further illustrates this idea of God's companionship, even in the midst of challenging circumstances.
Right, right.
And ultimately leading to recognition and even worship.
Right. And it's such a cool perspective to think about, why the prophets themselves might not have even fully grasped the Christ that they foretold.
Right.
And the sources suggest that it's because they were looking for, like, a man.
Yeah.
Like a specific individual at a specific point in time.
Right.
Rather than recognizing that this, like, internal spiritual awakening is the true fulfillment.
Yeah.
And so this interpretation also offers a potential explanation for why those who, know someone really well in their ordinary, like, everyday life might struggle to see the unfolding of Christ within them.
Right, because they have these established perceptions and expectations of that person.
Right.
Making it hard to accept the idea.
Of this profound internal transformation.
Right.
And so the typical reactions of disbelief or dismissal.
Yeah.
When someone shares these kinds of mystical experiences, they see that as stemming from this limited perspective.
Right, right. Before we wrap up, I just want to touch on something else that's mentioned in the source material, which is the crown of glory.
Okay.
So Paul talks about this.
Okay.
And the source is very clear to point out that this isn't a literal, like, physical crown, but rather it's something that develops and matures within the individual.
Right.
And it ties back to that whole imagery of, men like trees walking and that continuous, like, internal unfolding.
Right. It's understood as a metaphor for spiritual maturity.
Right.
The realized understanding.
Right.
And wisdom that blossoms within as this process progresses.
Right. Exactly. So just to kind of bring all these threads together, we've looked at the 4 presentations of Christ.
In the Gospels as king, servant, ideal man, and God.
Right.
Not as 4 separate individuals, but as 4 facets of the individual's own spiritual journey.
Yeah.
The fulfillment of Scripture happening within.
Right.
And I think a key message from the sources is this significance of engaging with the principle of conscious assumption in this very moment, right now.
Right.
So by assuming the feeling
Yeah.
of your desired reality right now, by really truly believing in the truth of that assumption, you initiate its manifestation.
Right.
That unwavering belief acts as that powerful word that inevitably fulfills its purpose.
That's right.
And finally, the source touches on the fundamental nature of God as our own consciousness,
Yeah.
our awareness of being, that core I am.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this profound mystery of God becoming human, so that humanity might, in turn, realize its own divine potential.
A truly transformative concept.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into these fascinating interpretations, consider this. the divine presence, that powerful I am, resides within you. It's an invitation to explore the profound mystery of your own being.
Yeah.
And the continuous unfolding of Christ within your own consciousness.
It's a journey of inward discovery, a personal exploration of the boundless potential that's held within the I am that you are.
Beautiful. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
See you next time.